Hello, the most famous ship ever, which almost no one on Earth hasn't heard of its story and the tragedy it faced, the British ship RMS Titanic. Its first voyage was also its last, as it sank to the bottom of the ocean under mysterious circumstances with hundreds of passengers on board, and only a few survived. This was one of the greatest human disasters the world has ever seen. The death of these passengers affected most human societies at the time, whether they were close to the incident or far from it. Even today, more than 100 years after the sad event, many people are still affected by the tragedy. The question that comes to some people's minds constantly is, why haven't we brought the Titanic up from the ocean yet, even though humanity now has the necessary equipment and modern submarines? It is supposed to be a special ship, and bringing it out of the water would be a huge event and might ease the bad memory of the ship's past. Moreover, bringing it up would help us understand the exact reasons for its sinking, which we could then avoid in future sea voyages. Welcome to the Ask Away channel, and today we will answer the question, why haven't we brought the Titanic up from the ocean yet? Before we start, if you are new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to receive our videos first. The Titanic, or the Mighty Giant, was rumored to be the unsinkable ship. It was designed by the British company White Star Line to compete with the large ships produced by rival companies. Indeed, when the Titanic appeared in 1911, it surpassed all the ships in the world at that time in terms of luxury, durability, and unsinkability. It was a symbol of grandeur and size, as its size was equal to that of a large football stadium. But sadly, despite all the safety and security standards, the ship only sailed one voyage. On April 10, 1912, it embarked on its first and last voyage, leaving the English port of Queenstown and heading proudly to the United States. It spent 4 days in the ocean without any obstacles or problems. At the end of the fourth day, precisely at midnight, the ship's lookout rang the alarm bells and reported an iceberg ahead. Despite the captain and crew's attempts to turn or veer off the iceberg's path, the ship collided with the iceberg, causing holes in the ship's lower hull. Water began to seep in, and the ship's bow started to sink gradually into the ocean. After about 2.5 hours, the ship sank and disappeared completely into the ocean, with 2,200 passengers on board. About 700 survived, and 1,500 died due to the lack of lifeboats, in one of the most famous disasters the world has ever seen. The sinking of the Titanic was not known to anyone until several days after the incident, specifically when the New York Herald newspaper announced the news of the Titanic disaster on its front page. The news spread worldwide. Just as the newspapers were interested in publishing the news of the Titanic's maiden voyage on April 10th, they were even more interested in publishing the news of its sinking. The newspapers began to write on their front pages in bold letters, "The ship of the rich sinks to the bottom of the ocean," or "The unsinkable ship now lies at the bottom." Although the newspapers at the time published a lot of news about the ship, they could not clarify the circumstances of the accident and the exact reason for the ship's sinking until they were able to gather enough information from the survivors and some crew members over time. Once the story became clear, demonstrations swept through the streets of London, and the city witnessed a great uproar due to the horrific accident that befell the ship and its passengers. The demonstrations condemned all the people responsible for the disaster and demanded decisive measures to ensure the safety of passengers on ships thereafter. However, experts at the time believed that despite the Titanic's sinking, it was still classified as one of the safest ships known to humanity. The main reason for its sinking was that the ship was surprised by the iceberg while moving at high speed, which was something beyond everyone's control. Aside from the reason for the ship's sinking, it still lies at the bottom of the ocean. So why have they left it in the ocean all this time? Was it because they didn't have enough money to fund the project to extract the ship? Certainly not, as most of the victims' families were wealthy, and funding such a project would have been easy. So was it a problem of equipment? Didn't they have the necessary machines to extract it? The truth is also no, as there were equipment and machines even at that time. So if all these things were available then, Why haven't they brought the ship up from the ocean to this day? The main reason they haven't brought the Titanic up from the water is that they didn't know its exact location. The Titanic didn't sink in a lake or a swimming pool, it sank in the Atlantic Ocean, the second largest ocean in the world. The coordinates of the site where the ship sank were unknown, and parts of the ship do not stay in the place where they fall but move and drift due to currents. Therefore, no one at the time knew the exact location of the ship. Despite this, they said, from now until we determine its location, we will try to propose some solutions to extract the ship. Experts and non-experts began to suggest ideas and scenarios through which they could easily extract the Titanic from the ocean. Some suggested using a giant electromagnet, lowering it into the water to attract the ship's hull, and once the ship stuck to the magnet, they would pull it out immediately. Other ideas included using liquid nitrogen to freeze the entire ship's hull, so when the ship freezes and becomes an ice block, it would start to rise on its own and float on the ocean's surface like ice cubes floating on water. Everyone was sharing their opinions, and humanity, in general, had a great passion for extracting the Titanic from the ocean. But unfortunately, while people were proposing their ideas and discussing them, something happened that cut off everyone's thoughts. This was World War I, followed by World War II, which were significant factors in neglecting the scientific community's interest in the Titanic for decades. But once the wars ended and things settled down, people began to talk about the ship again and ways to extract it. Marine institutions started creating maps of the ocean depths and consulting experts and researchers to determine the exact location of the ship. But until 1985, all attempts failed. The sinking of the Titanic became a cultural phenomenon revived by artists, filmmakers, writers, and musicians. But once the ship was discovered, it was no longer enough to revive it artistically. Humanity was determined to bring it up from the water. On September 1, 1985, an American-French expedition led by Robert Ballard discovered the wreck of the Titanic at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, about 73 years after the ship sank. However, the team of explorers noticed that the ship had split in half shortly after sinking, before it even reached the bottom. Its remains spread over an area with a diameter of 1,600 meters and at a depth of over 3,800 meters. There were a large number of items and belongings around the ship, such as dishes, furniture, boxes, and metals. Although some things were in good condition, the ship itself was severely damaged due to being in the ocean for so long. Despite the explorers spending long years searching for it, they decided not to bring it up from the water. All they did was place a sign that read, "The ship is very damaged and in poor condition. Please do not touch it," and then they left the ship and surfaced again. So why didn't they bring the ship up from the water? And what is the story of this sign? After more than 70 years of searching and finding it, they simply left it and moved on. Why didn't they even try to bring it up? In fact, there were several attempts to extract the ship from the ocean, but the explorers found that the ship's hull had become completely fragile and weak. Any attempt to extract the ship would lead to the entire ship's body collapsing and turning to dust. It is expected that within the next 40 years, the ship will collapse on its own. Additionally, the ship's hull has been corroded by bacteria called halomonas, which can eat iron. All the experts could do was make a global agreement to secure the maritime area where the Titanic sank and keep the ship at the bottom of the ocean under UNESCO protection, turning it into an underwater cultural heritage site that cannot be rescued or even approached. All we can do now is watch the countdown to its disappearance in the coming years, completely unable to offer any help or even save it. In the end, the Titanic itself was not salvaged and brought up from the ocean, but this does not mean that some belongings and small pieces related to the ship were not brought up. Indeed, items related to the Titanic have been displayed in many museums around the world. For example, the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, Canada, contains a collection of wooden fragments, seats, and wheelchairs retrieved from the sea by Canadian search ships that recovered the victims' bodies. There are also exhibitions in other museums around the world that display various artifacts from the Titanic, such as dishes, jewelry, and personal belongings of the passengers. There is also the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich and the Siacity Museum in Southampton, which contain items donated by survivors and relatives of the victims, including items retrieved from the victims' bodies themselves. Finally, one of the strange items retrieved from the water is a watch belonging to one of the victims that stopped at exactly 2:28, just minutes after its owner entered the water, serving as a permanent witness to one of the human events where time stood still. And with that, we have answered today's question, why haven't we brought the Titanic up from the ocean yet? As always, if you have a question that puzzles you, write it in the comments below the video so we can answer it.